As we continue our discussions on the future of history, this morning we are delighted to welcome back to Chautauqua Annette Gordon-Reed, the Carl M. Loeb University Professor at Harvard University, where her areas of interest include American legal history. Professor Gordon-Reed has won 16 book prizes, including the Pulitzer Prize in History in 2009 and the National Book Award in 2008 for the Hemingses of Monticello, An American Family, which was a Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle selection in 2009. Her most recent book is On Juneteenth, which was published last year. Previously, Professor Gordon-Reed was the Vyvyan Harmsworth Visiting Professor of American History at the University of Oxford, Queens College, and the Carol K. Pforzheimer Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. She was the 2018-2019 President of the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. A selected list of her honors includes a fellowship from the Dorothy and Lewis B. Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library, a Guggenheim Fellowship in the Humanities, a MacArthur Fellowship, the National Humanities Medal, the Frederick Douglass Book Prize, the George Washington Book Prize, and the Anisfield-Wolf Book Award. It is our honor to host Professor Gordon-Reed and her husband, Judge Robert Reed, this morning on this return visit to Chautauqua, made possible by the McCready Family Fund. This morning's lecture shares its title with her most recent book, On Juneteenth. Please join me in offering a warm Chautauqua welcome to Annette Gordon-Reed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be back here and to enjoy this wonderful weather. My husband and I got here yesterday, and it was somewhat rainy. And we had planned a trip up to Niagara Falls, and we decided to take it anyway. And we got there, and it was nice and sunny, and we went on the Maid of the Mist and got totally drenched. So that was a wonderful beginning to my stay here at Chautauqua. I wish I could stay longer. One of the things that I've learned in writing books and publishing books is that you never know what world the book will enter when it's published. You start out in one place, and when the book comes out, you're in another place. And I had this feeling most strongly this past year when my book On Juneteenth came out. I had not originally planned to write a book about Juneteenth or about Texas, but my editor had been after me for a number of years to write a big book about Texas, and I had resisted that. I spend most of my time talking about Virginia and slavery at Monticello and Jefferson and the early American Republic. I'm steeped in that world. But he thought that writing about Texas would be a good thing. I'm from Now, come on. I'm a native Texan, and I spend a lot of my time explaining Texas to people, or trying to explain Texas to people. I've been on the East Coast now since I was 18, went to Dartmouth College and then Harvard Law School and then moved to New York. So I've been on the East Coast a long time, and explaining Texas is something that I've had to do from time to time. And during the pandemic, Bob, my editor, suggested again that I write something, but I write something small. And I was, small meaning short. I was in New York, holed up during the pandemic, and I'm sure you know that New York City was ground zero for a time for that, so we spent most of our time indoors, and I decided to write a small book about Texas, a short book, 30,000 words or so, and I would talk about myself, which I don't typically do, but I would try to explain the state through my family's history. And I thought that this was an important thing to do, not just to explain Texas to other people, but because we were at a particular moment in time. I've been hearing a lot about Juneteenth, the holiday that commemorates the day that Gordon Granger comes to Galveston and announces the end of slavery. I'd known that it was becoming a more well-known holiday. This is something I celebrated as a child, and as a matter of course, it was just what we did. And in the past 10 years, I'd noticed that other people were celebrating, and I'd understood this before, and I mentioned in the book that I had sort of a tinge of possessiveness about this. Why are people celebrating our holiday? But that changed as I realized that this was an advance in human rights, and we should all celebrate advances in human rights. And so this is a day, it's a day that belonged to everybody. So I understood that people might be interested in the book, but something else happened in 2020. It happened in May of 2020, and it was the murder of George Floyd. And after that, and I'm sure you recall the groundswell of support that went all around the world in a way that actually surprised me. In almost every major capital in the world, and in small cities and towns in the United States, there were demonstrations saying that Black Lives Matter. That phrase had come under a lot of attack. People had, I think, distorted what it meant, suggesting that it meant that only Black lives matter, but what it meant, obviously, was that Black lives matter too. And that seemed to have been lost on a number of occasions. That idea was lost on a number of occasions, including with the murder of Floyd. So there was this groundswell of support in May, and in the weeks after that, and I should say after it became apparent that this, because the video had gone around the world and people understood what had happened. And Juneteenth came, and there was an outpouring of interest in Juneteenth. And people ask me very often, do you think that the response to the book and the holiday, becoming a national holiday, had to do with the Floyd murder? And I think it actually did. Because people were thinking about how we had gotten to a point where something like this could happen. And slavery, of course, the legacies of slavery are still with us. And there was an understanding that the holiday, which celebrated or commemorated the end of slavery in Texas, made us think about the institution overall and what it had done to the people who were in the institution, what it had done to the people who perpetrated the oppression, and what it had done to the country even after it was over. The legacies of slavery that are with us. Slavery being racially based in the United States created a racial hierarchy. It deepened a racial hierarchy. It told white people how they were to think about blacks and think of themselves, and it tried to tell Black people how we should think about ourselves. There was resistance to that idea, but the hierarchy was very, very much there. So I thought that I could write a book that would address this question, not thinking that there would be a federal holiday the month after the book came out, which was fortunate, and that was one of the unanticipated things. I mentioned in the book that it's startling that there was no holiday commemorating things, not thinking that this was going to go anywhere. And thanks to the efforts of many, many people, Miss Opal Lee, who's considered the grandmother of Juneteenth, people like that who actually worked for this holiday for many, many years, it became a national holiday a month after the book came out. So that was one unexpected thing that would happen after the publication of the book. I don't think the book made that happen, but it did I like to think, have something of a fetch. Maybe it was a little push in that direction. But something else happened along this time period and after the book came out. And I'm sure you have heard about the efforts in Texas to downplay what is taught about slavery, what is taught about race. And it's not just in Texas. The effort has spread to other parts of the country as well. And this is an odd moment to have a book come out that is expressly about history, the good history and the bad history of a particular place, to have many legislative attempts to tamp down on thinking about the very issues that the book addresses. So what did I wanted to do with the book? And this is something that I'm used to controversy because of writing about Jefferson, obviously, and a lot of the issues in his life. But I hadn't anticipated that there would be legislative attempts to actually stop people from discussing the kinds of things that I talk about in the book. You know, one of the points that I make, and this is lost on many people apparently, is that loving a place or loving anything doesn't require you to be uncritical. In fact, you have a duty, a responsibility to speak honestly and to write honestly and to talk honestly about problems, issues, ways that people, ways that institutions, organizations can be made better. Just saying that everything is okay and everything, is going to work out is not enough. It requires being critical. And what I say in the book about Texas, what I've said about Jefferson, what I've said about every subject that I've written about, tries to balance the good with the bad and be as realistic as I can about the subject matter, because I want readers to get as true a picture as I can paint of a particular place, of a particular moment. And what people in Texas are thinking at this point, the people who are writing these laws, is that loving something, loving the places, means that you can't talk about the bad things that happen there. It also suggests that children don't have the capacity to sort things out and to understand that there's good and that there's bad, that they can't love their state, that they can't love their country if they recognize things that are less than perfect about the state or the country. And I want to disabuse people of that notion. There's also a sense, I think on some people's part, that if you talk about the painful lessons in history and you mention bad things of which you might be ashamed or feel defensive, that you will lose your children, that the children will actually, well, I should put it this way, that there are people who feel that their children might move away from them. One of the great controversies now is that about a book about Ruby Bridges, who was the little girl who integrated schools in New Orleans. And I'm sure you've probably seen pictures of her, photographs of her being escorted into school by federal marshals. And I think Rockwell did a portrait about this. And this is this iconic moment. And the complaint is that there was a children's book about this. And in the children's book, there are mobs of angry white people yelling at her as she's going into the school. The problem is that there were mobs of angry white people yelling at her as she went into the schools. And it's the truth. But there was also a teacher, a white teacher who worked with Ruby Bridges. When she came to school, everybody else had left, and she worked with Ruby. So what is the problem here? The parents who don't like this book, do they not want it shown that there were people doing that? Are they upset about the portrayal of these people, that they're made to look bad? Children will identify, obviously, with Ruby, but they may identify with the teacher as well. If they're going to be doing these things on the basis of race, there was a white person who was doing the right thing in that circumstance. Why fixate or be concerned about the people outside yelling unless you want those people portrayed as heroes in some fashion, as admirable in some way? Why would you think that the kids would automatically not automatically assume that Ruby is bad or that the white teacher was bad? It's obvious that there's some discomfort. They may think that, they may remember that their parents were out there yelling or what their parents had to say about it, and there's some discomfort with that. So there's a feeling that you don't want your children moving away from your values, even when those values are not great. Values of white supremacy, values of keeping the races separated, all those kinds of things that make people discomforted by the story of Ruby Bridges. Now, I talk in my book about my own experience with that because I integrated the schools of our town and in Conroe, Texas. And I wasn't escorted by marshals. It was a much more low-key thing. My father took me to school and dropped me off. And it was supposed to be normal. It wasn't totally normal. It was a strange situation because I was the only black person there. And I was on display, very much people coming to stand in the doorway and look to see this thing, this situation with a black child in a school with, in a class with 20 or 25 other white students. So I knew it was not normal, and I understood by the way people responded to me and the way they talked about this that it wasn't a normal situation. But it made me understand the importance of history. I think I may have become a historian, and certainly interested in law because of that experience, being in Anderson Elementary School by myself there for the first year, and the following year another girl came, and then later when the Supreme Court struck down the freedom of choice plans, which had operated in my hometown and in other places where white parents were supposed to pick white schools and black parents were supposed to pick black schools, and my parents did something different. Eventually that plan was struck down, and then the schools were all mixed, and integration came to my hometown. But that experience made me think about, as I said, history. Why was this the circumstance? Why was it a big deal that I was going to school with white kids? Why is it that when I went to the doctor, there was a separate waiting room for white patients and black patients? When we went to the movies, black people had to sit in the balcony. And I understood that this separation was in force, and I had an inkling that there was something in the past that made this the custom, and what was that? And I also understood that law had been the mechanism for changing that. So I think this experience, as tough as it was something that probably put me on the road to doing the kinds of things that I've done in life and made me understand the importance of moments in history. I've often thought, I have 2 kids, whether I would have done that. If I had been one of my parents, if I had, looking at my kids, would I have sent them into that situation? And I generally say no, I wouldn't have. But as a historian, I understand that these things happen in a particular context. And in my parents' context in the mid-60s, they were in the middle of a movement. They were in a little town far away from, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, or far away from all of the things that had happened in the 50s and the 60s, or the big marches on Washington and so forth. But they saw themselves as part of a movement. And so, whereas I think of myself, I mean, my kids were small in the 90s, nothing was going on in the 90s, there was no movement in the 90s that I would have been a part of. My parents saw themselves as that, and so I can't really compare my circumstances to theirs because every historical moment, its context is unique and it has its own feel. So I think that they felt emboldened by all of that to send me into that circumstance, and I understand what they did. It was a courageous thing to do. They obviously had some degree of faith in me that it could be done, and they had faith that it would work out. And it did work out. There were moments that were not great, but for the most part, I have to say my teachers were, not for the most part, they were totally supportive and wonderful to me. And it's not until after I wrote the book, and I didn't think of this until I wrote the book, that maybe the fact that my mother was a teacher, she taught in the black school, may have influenced the way the teachers at Anderson treated me. This could have been a teacher-to-teacher courtesy here, although they were wonderful people in their own right, but I wonder if that did not also influenced how well they treated me and how they made me feel at home. Some of the kids were okay, some of them were not. But again, they were in this moment where there was this moment of change. And as we know, as we should know, that when there are moments of change, there's backlash. And I really do think that one of the things that is happening now, that we see now with these efforts to tamp down on what is taught in history in schools, comes out of the recognition that teachers and museums and other public history sites have done a good job actually of being inclusive. And I think that there's a response, this is a response to all of that, with people saying, wait a minute, you have these thousands of people all over the world coming out to say Black Lives Matter. What's up with that? Where did they learn that? And I think people were genuinely, as I was, surprised by that, whereas I thought that that was positive, that it suggested that maybe the world could change and we could go forward. I think a number of people saw that as threatening. And you began to get this backlash against history and public schools and museums, and with this idea that things had changed enough that we might go forward with a different kind of understanding about a racial hierarchy. So when I was writing this book, I didn't think about the possibility that there would be this kind of backlash. I didn't know what form it would take. Now, as for teaching about Juneteenth, is anybody here from Texas? Oh my goodness, that's more than I would have thought, okay? Juneteenth has been celebrated by Black Texans since it came out 1865, essentially, and the state made it a holiday in 1980. So it's something of long standing, and people there kind of understand what it's supposed to be about and why it's important. Now, with it as a federal holiday, we have an opportunity, I think, to sort of change the narrative, to think about what can be done to move things forward, despite what is happening in these legislatures and in school boards around, and in libraries. I mean, I never thought I would see such concerted efforts, and in some instances, successful efforts to ban books, I read about libraries, library closing because of complaints about the books that were being offered in the public library. The public library, to me, was an oasis when I was growing up. That's where I spent time. That's where I learned, what was possible in the world. And I mean, sure, there were books that we were not supposed to be able to check out unless your parents agreed to it, but in general, it was a place of freedom, and it's depressing to me to think that we're in a moment now where people don't understand that. That always struck me as a place that would be, you could not violate, that this was a place that everybody understood why it was important to let people seek knowledge and to learn freely in places. And so, this is a tough moment for me, but I'm happy, I'm sort of heightened, sort of gladdened, because there are people who are standing up against that, people who are coming out to make complaints about that and to defend libraries and defend public teachers and to defend the dissemination of knowledge to children appropriately. And that's the struggle that I think that we're in right now, and one that I hadn't anticipated existing when I was writing On Juneteenth. And I wonder if the book will even be accepted in Texas. I'm sure it will be, because Juneteenth is sort of an allowable thing. As I was saying, this is something that we've done all along, but the substance of the book, some of the things I talk about in the book, the Alamo, for example, and I'm sure that you've heard about the struggle over public monuments and public history sites, what can be taught there, what monuments can be up. And for Texans, the Alamo is a special thing. Remember the Alamo. And I remember growing up being taught in my 4th grade and 7th grade history. You can teach, you have 4th grade and 7th grade Texas history in Texas. And you can take it again in high school as an elective. I think I had 3 years of Texas history, K through 12. And the Alamo stands as a symbol of bravery, a symbol of sticking to your guns, that you were supposed to stand up for what you believe in. It wasn't until I was in high school that I understood that one of the reasons the Texians wanted to leave Texas, not the only reason, but one of the reasons, is that Mexico had outlawed slavery in 1829. So the Texians, Texas was started by people who wanted to bring slavery into the region. It was going to be a part of the Cotton Empire. Stephen F. Austin, who is the father of Texas, for whom the capital is named, said that if white people came to Texas without slavery, they could expect to be poor for many years. And he claimed he was anti-slavery. He didn't like slavery not because of the moral implications, but because he did not like the idea of so many black people in the region. So there was discomfort with black people that was the real impetus for his concern about slavery, but he thought that it was nevertheless vital to the region because it was the only way that they could develop the cotton system and sugarcane. So the state was formed. It wasn't the state at this point, but the region was settled by Anglo-Americans with the idea that slavery would be an integral part of the state. And in fact, Mexico gave them an exemption from their edict against slavery, but the Texians, which is what they were called at the time, didn't trust them. And so they broke away and formed the Republic of Texas. Now, Texans are very, very proud of the Republic of Texas. It was its own country. But again, there's this dissonance for people who are anti-slavery or black people who think about this republic that was founded to protect slavery. And indeed, the Constitution of Texas explicitly condones slavery. It also says that African American people can't or could not migrate to Texas without the permission of the legislature. They couldn't become citizens of the Republic of Texas. So how do you, in 4th grade, in 7th grade, and in high school, teach about the Republic of Texas without mentioning the Constitution? You have to talk about it. And the Constitution itself says these things. The American Constitution kind of downplays slavery, persons held to service. It doesn't want to use the word slavery. you can see that even though they were slaveholders, many of them, there was a discomfort with this idea of openly talking about the institution. The Texas Constitution, no holds barred, talks about slavery and people of African descent not becoming citizens. You can't get around that. There's no way to teach this history without mentioning that. And so what do? For me, you use the primary documents of the Republic of Texas's Constitution, and you say that, but you talk about the changes that were made. You talk about the fact that we're not hostage to that history. That may have been what they believed then, but we believe something different now. And I don't understand why it's a problem, such a problem, an insurmountable problem, that people would think that if you said this, then white students would feel bad and reject Texas as their home. They will feel bad, but there's nothing wrong with feeling bad. Sometimes, no, I mean, feeling bad could be the first step to thinking about doing things differently and making a different world. And I can't help but think that some people who see it otherwise don't want a different world, actually don't want to see things change, because young people can handle this, I think, easily. They understand that people thought a lot of things in the past that we've learned better than and we've moved on from. But to say that you shouldn't even talk about this kind of thing is trying to keep people ignorant and to keep people in place, to keep the status quo. And that typically doesn't work. That doesn't work. Young people, the worst thing you can do, young people don't like to be lied to, because when they find out that they've been lied to, that breeds cynicism. And that isn't what you need in a republic, a democratic republic. You need people who can be idealistic. You need people who can trust. Skepticism is good, but cynicism and nihilism is not the answer in the kind of society that was supposed to be the American experiment. And young people will learn the kinds of things that I learned as a teenager. I had been taught that Mexicans were the enemy, that they were the bad guys, when in fact, as I said, they had outlawed slavery in 1829. And in Texas, when you think about people running away from slavery, escaping from slavery, you talk about going north, follow the North Star. In Texas, people ran south. They ran into Mexico. There was an article in the Times a couple of years ago about a group of people in Mexico, who sing spirituals in English, and they're not really sure what the words mean, because these were things that were handed down to them by grandparents, great-grandparents through the years, people who had escaped from Texas into Mexico and formed communities there. And so this idea of Mexicans as implacably the enemy doesn't work. It didn't work. That was another thing that taught me about the complexity of history, that we have so many things that we have to learn, so many different competing interests are in play in given circumstances, that there is no black and white totally, that there are complications that we have to know about in order for us to understand the history before we can go forward. Now, this isn't just about Texas, obviously. My other subject, Jefferson, and the members of the founding generation have come under a lot of scrutiny in the past few years, I would say. I'm on the board of the New York Historical Society, and we recently got a statue of Jefferson that had been in the city council New York City Council for many, many years, since the 19th century actually, that was people wanted to move because the city council members did not feel comfortable with the statue of Jefferson there. And I understand the issue, but we decided to take the statue at the New York Historical Society and contextualize it and explain why Jefferson was a controversial figure, explain his contributions, but at the same time talk about the side of him that is less than admirable, or not admirable at all, I should say, Jefferson the slaveholder, and put those things together. You know, many people say that what you do with these monuments is you take them to the museums, and museums are like, hey, wait a minute. We don't have space for all of these things. We don't have space for the things we have now, much less all of these statues, which are not always art, pieces of art. A lot of them were just cookie cutter. The Union soldier is the same as the Southern soldier, and they're all around. You know, it really doesn't matter. But we're bringing him to the Historical Society and to talk about him. And I'm of two minds about this. David Blight and I are very often on panels, and we go back and forth. You know, he is not for moving any kind of monuments. He thinks it's a mistake to do that. I think some people can go. I think the Confederates can go. You know, it's just, you know, when you lose a war, you don't get to put up monuments to yourself. And you don't get to put up monuments on battlefields. Sure, in cemeteries, things like that, places where people have died and you want to commemorate the war dead, and I get that. But in courthouses and in public spaces where people are coming to get justice, to have a statue of a Confederate there, just think about how black plaintiffs, people who are coming into those places, feel in that particular setting, to think, you know, that this is the place that I'm coming to get justice, and there's no reason to think you're going to get it in a place that is communicating those values. And those monuments, again, we go back to history, and I talked about context and thinking about my parents and how they decided to send me to this school. This happened in a particular moment. Well, we could think about that with the monuments as well. They were put up at a particular moment. Many of them were put up in the 20s, in the 30s, as people were beginning to fight for civil rights. It was a message. Some of them actually had on the bottom of them white supremacy. And I saw a couple of them, you know, with white supremacy on it. And they're not talking about just honoring Confederate war dead. It's saying, who is in control of this society? And so when we think about when they were put up, you think about why they were put up. You think about the circumstances of them being put up, namely that this was a time when black people in the South particularly were not allowed to vote. So it would not have been a community decision in the way we actually think of a community decision, when a good part of the population, in some places maybe almost a third of the population or half of the population, couldn't even speak on the subject. So you can't say that this was a choice that was made by the community. So for me, those kind of monuments, if people make the decision that they want them gone, then to me, that's fine. that's the correct choice to make. I've said before that, you know, I see a difference between the members of the founding generation and the Confederates. I think there's a difference between having fought to create the United States and having fought to destroy the United States. Those are two different things. And I understand the ambivalence about Jefferson and Madison and Washington and so forth. But the founding generation, for my mind, it's better to do the kind of thing that we're doing at New York Historical Society. That is to say, looking at a monument and contextualizing it, explaining the person's strengths and the weaknesses, because you don't, to me, as a historian, and I won't even say as a historian, because that sounds like pulling rank in a way, just as an individual and as a person who likes history, I would say, you want to keep the people who were central to history somewhere, essential to the creation of the country, in place. And as I said, contextualizing, talking about them is a way to stop it from being the sort of utter hero worship that people may have done in the past. And I think young people, my students at least, don't have the kind of, I don't know, don't seem to hero worship people the way other generations did. I think, now that's good and bad, but I think that they have a more realistic picture of individuals and can take the idea of a Jefferson and a Washington and even a Lincoln, because I hear that there have been moves to try to, to get rid of him in places as well. Could take a complex Lincoln, a complex Jefferson, and will not view the statues in the same way that they were viewed in the past, that this is a god that we should be worshiping in some way. That's not at all what they do, and that's not what they should do. So I think as we move forward here with a more inclusive understanding of what our history is and how we should commemorate it, there will be a more realistic understanding about individuals. One of the things that happens very often and doesn't, one of the problems with integration or inclusiveness as we think of it, is if you think people are going to join in a community, join in an area, and remain silent about the things that bother them. That in other words, you just move in, but nothing changes. I mentioned my parents' idealism about integration when they sent me to Anderson Elementary School. I should say that over the years, as they saw how all of this played out, there was some discomfort about what had happened, because there had been integration, but only at a certain level. The kids were brought in, we were mixed together, the teachers not as much. My mother was a teacher, she remained in the classroom, but other teachers in my town, and also throughout the South, black teachers were removed from schools. They were taken out of the classroom. So black students lost role models, and white students lost the opportunity to have black teachers as role models. So integration, this new inclusiveness, all of these kinds of things have to take into account that when people feel comfortable, truly comfortable in a setting, in a particular place, they will demand, and they rightly so, that accommodations be made to the circumstances. I think one of the things that's happening on college campuses now with complaints about names of buildings, at Yale there was Calhoun, at Princeton there was Wilson, and other places, is that the students who are there now feel comfortable. They actually feel that they belong there. When I went to Dartmouth, I think, and the generations before us, immediately before us, when there were large numbers of black kids in Ivy League schools and other predominantly white institutions, we were just happy to be there. We were just happy to be there. I felt at home at Dartmouth, but I think the next generations of people really feel at home and saying, this is our place too, and there's some things about it we'd like to change. Some things we want to keep, some things we want to change. Same with women. When I went to Dartmouth, they had just gone co-ed, a few years that they'd been co-ed, and they were keeping it at 3-to-1. 3 males for every 1 female. And that was good in some ways. In other ways, not so great. You could feel overwhelmed. The first day I went there, I remember going into the dining hall, and I walked in, and the athletic teams had just gotten out. So they were all in there, and it was just wall-to-wall guys. And I just kind of turned and walked right out. It was too intimidating at that moment. But now Dartmouth is 50-50, and it has managed to change, to be the same in many ways, but to change enormously. the way that's happened, to accommodate women who were there, to accommodate more blacks, more black people who were there, a much more diverse student body. So as the world changes, we talk about inclusiveness, we talk about integration and all those things, we have to think about the changes that have to be made internally as people become comfortable in this particular space. Now that's going to cause problems, and as I suggested before, a lot of the things that are happening now is a backlash against the effort, once you have this new vision of things, to change things. But things are going to change. And the hope is that the good things will be kept and the bad things will go away. That's what we're going to try to work for, but there has to be a change. Jefferson, in a letter he wrote to Madison in 1789, he's in Paris and he's writing to Madison about constitutions, but he's talking about life in general, and he says, the earth belongs, and he says, in usufruct to the living, but it means for the uses of the living. The earth belongs to the living. And the idea, and he sounds this theme in a number of other letters, is that every generation of people has to make its own story. And he was talking about constitutions. But he meant just in life in general, as I said. Every generation has to make these choices for themselves. And so this would work to his, you wonder what he would say about moving his monuments, because what is happening, that process is taking place. Generations of people are saying, maybe we want other heroes, maybe other people in addition to you, but maybe your monument can go somewhere else. I think he would probably understand that as a concept. But we're in a moment now where the country is in somewhat of a turmoil. I mean, as a person who writes about the early American Republic, and I look at where we are now, and I think to myself, is this what this all was for? Is this what they envisioned for us at this particular moment? And I would say probably not. But there are many things that he envisioned. They didn't envision me, certainly. But that was part of the limits of their imagination, I think, there, and their own self-interest in lots of ways. But in terms of thinking about the direction of the country, the direction of our democracy and so forth, this is a moment for thinking about history and thinking about how we want to write the next story of the American experiment. And this is it's a tough time. And with people battling about history, history has always been contentious from the very, very beginning. Who writes the story? Who tells what's happening? And who tells, who are the heroes and who are the villains? That's, in some ways, a very political thing. And we're in a moment now where people are trying to figure all of this out and decide which direction that we want to go in. I am actually optimistic. I mean, I have to be optimistic. I don't have a choice but being optimistic. One of the things in writing on Juneteenth and thinking about those people who in 1865 were happy about the end of legalized slavery, and people ask me, should we celebrate this or is it a commemoration? And I think it's both. It's a celebration because the people were genuinely happy, learning that it would no longer be legal to separate their families, to sell people, to lose family members. That by far, as a person, if you read the narratives of enslaved people and the stories of enslaved people, by far the most traumatic thing was not the whipping, which is bad, obviously, working for no pay, but being separated from families. And the phrase never to be seen again is considered, it recurs in these statements. After 1865, after the end of slavery, of all of slavery, after the end of the war, they put ads, there are ads in newspapers, people saying, have you seen my mother? Have you seen my sister? When last we were in we were in Alabama and we were in Mississippi and we were separated and so forth. So this notion of family and the idea of coming together and the loss of family was a painful thing for people who learned that this would no longer happen and became extremely happy at the prospect of being able to keep their families together. So when I think about people who had suffered that and who understood, even after Granger makes his order saying that General Order Number 3, that slavery is over, they know that they're going to be in a struggle. And I think about these 4 men in Houston who pooled their resources and bought land to celebrate emancipation. And that kind of act of faith, this is in 1876, and these are black people in 1876 in Texas, was not an easy time. And yet they had faith to purchase land, certain that future generations would recognize that particular day and keep celebrating it. And we have. So I think about that kind of faith in the face of terrible odds, and I don't really feel that I have the luxury of despair, the luxury of being anything other than optimistic, because they had optimism and they had faith that things would get better and that things would go forward. So even in my most depressed moments about where we are, I want to maintain that kind of faith because they kept faith and hoped that future generations of people would have opportunities that they never have. And I think of myself as very much like those people, very much like my parents, my grandparents and my great-grandparents who didn't have the opportunities that I've had. So I want to make something of that by keeping my heart open, keeping my mind open, and having faith that the American experiment, that the words of the Declaration, that we take to be our creed, we say that very often, will be something that we will remember as a part of our history that informs our present and gives us hope for the future. So with that, I would like to take your questions. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. You going to do the honors?
So for those of you who are leaving for other programs, we do ask that you do so quietly out of respect for those who are staying behind as we transition into Q&A. Professor Gordon-Reed, I wanted to start in thinking about the moment we're in terms of the complication of history. And part of that, I think, also is inside the way in the sources with which we are understanding history, even beyond the classroom. I think of having an 11-year-old son who's interested in history and what it means for him to take a book out of the library and look to me and say, well, this has to be true, right? It's not YouTube, it's not social media, and so forth. Can you just speak to how we as parents can support our children at this moment where they are asking questions about where I can go for sources and the value of that complication of understanding of history?
Well, talking to them about it, talking about the complications of history, encouraging them to look to other sources. YouTube and the internet we all Google things for answers, quick answers to things, but they're superficial answers to things. So I would say you do it by modeling the behavior, by telling them that you look to a number of sources before you come to a conclusion. Think about the expertise of the sources. I know that expertise is a word that has kind of fallen out of favor in some ways, but some people do know more about things than I know about things, and I would trust those people to give me an answer. So I think encouraging them to look to other sources and to variety of sources, and modeling the behavior of doing that is important for them.
This person writes, I'm 25. I agree that we don't hero worship like older generations, but looking back, my history classes felt like propaganda. In college, I learned harsh truths about our heroes of history. How do you think that impacts those who don't attend college?
Mm-hmm. Wow, yeah. Well, that's a good question. One of my colleagues, Jane Kamensky, wrote this wonderful essay about, she had a class on the American Revolution, and she had a student who was a Minuteman, who did the kind of enactments of Minutemen at the beginning. And afterwards, she saw him after the class was over, and she asked him, so how's the Minuteman thing going? He said, oh, I don't do that anymore, because I found out that all of that was just, from your class, that all of that was meaningless or whatever. And she said her heart dropped, because that was not what she wanted. You know, even college students to think, you know, didn't want them to think that it was meaningless, that she had, you know, conveyed that message to them. I think people who are not in college probably get their, I would imagine, get a lot of their information from the internet, and probably, or television, and might have less exposure to the idea of the flaws of members of the founding generation, and maybe people who automatically, or think that if you're bringing those up, if they hear about them, would probably just dismiss it out of hand. I think it's, you know, it's a tough thing, because I'm trying to think of where people would learn about it other than History Channel things, as I said, on the internet, and that tends to be much more worshipful, I would say, much less into the flaws. So I think college students probably get more of that than people outside of them, and will continue to have more of a hero worship than people in college. But we don't want to go too far with that. My point about the Jane story is that I think that historians sometimes can go too far in presenting the negative things without balancing it more, in a better way.
Has a glossing over of the post-Civil War Reconstruction era in education caused some of the divisiveness that we are currently experiencing now?
I think so. I mean, I remember my history, and you shouldn't judge by my experiences, but Reconstruction was glossed over. It was just the war, and then all of a sudden we're in the progressive era. And we don't think about what happened in the middle there. People don't realize that this was a moment when a lot of people were open to the idea of a much more inclusive society. The so-called radical Republicans who were in Congress at the time proposed a lot of things, and the court at that time was a conservative court. We're thinking that the court today is the first conservative court. The court has always been more conservative than other branches of government. People don't know that there was a moment when other things were considered. So we think a lot of the stuff that we think is newfangled now were things that were considered way back at that time. And I think if people had been exposed to that, it wouldn't seem so weird to us today. We would realize that some of these notions of equality, all those kinds of things, were, people made an attempt during that time period. And so it wouldn't seem as radical.
Do you think our cultural difficulty with accepting that something can be worthy of love and also deeply flawed is a quintessential American trait? Can we grow out of it as a society?
Wow. I think all countries have mythology, have their mythologies. The French have their mythologies. The British do as well. I think that we may be more idealistic in that sense, and that could be an American trait, because we're a young country, and we focus on founders more than other countries do. I was talking to a South American historian, and he said that in North America and South America, we tend to focus on founders because we're relatively new. We know who they are, you know, and once you fixate on a person, it becomes personal, right? You know Jefferson, you can go to Jefferson's house, or you go to Washington's house, and fixating on a person as a founder, I think might lend itself to this notion of love and hate. You must love this person. I mean, who is the founder of France? You know, who are the founders of Great Britain? I mean, they have or China. I mean, it's 5,000-year history, more than that. And so we're so close to it that it's individualized, and the personification of it lends itself to idealizing people and loving people or hating people. So I think that aspect of it is American. I think as we go away from this, I don't know how long it will take, but as the centuries go by, if we're still around, I think that attitude will stop. I don't think we will fixate as much on the founders as we do now, because it's really close. We're still close to them. I mean, you could talk to somebody, you know, I was talking to a Jefferson descendant who was mentioning that he knew someone who who had had dinner at Monticello, like a great-grandfather back to that time period. One of the grandsons of, is it Tyler? Is still alive. He had kids as an older guy, and then his kid had a kid as an older guy. These people are still close to us, and so they're real to us in a way they won't be 400 years from now.
There are some questions around the Texas curriculum. Can you provide some examples of that which is deemed, you know, acceptable, not acceptable in terms of the classroom and the teaching of?
Well, nobody knows. It's so vague. That's the problem. It's like things that are designed that will make people feel uncomfortable. You're not supposed to talk about, say that one race is superior to another. But who does that, right? I mean, in school, that's not, but it's all inference. It's about, the fear is that people will go overboard in trying to meet the requirements or not, you know, teach something that makes one race superior to another. No one has ever said that in any classroom that I was in. But it's seen as saying that black people, for example, that whites are responsible for slavery, or that slavery is racially based would be problematic because you have to talk about slavery in other places. But we're talking about Texas. You're talking about the United States, the way it was done. So it's all very, very vague. The language is vague, and people are wondering about what it is. People are accused of teaching critical race theory, even though they're not. Critical race theory is in law schools, and it's not even taught in all law schools. It's anything about race is seen as problematic. And if you make people feel bad, then you're in trouble. But what is that exactly? It's the vagueness of it that causes the problem.
What is the appropriate role of the local community and parents in specifically what is taught in their schools?
Well, be involved in the school board. I mean, America has, I mean, the schools are in the province of localities. I think people should be involved in the school board. People should be involved in the PTA. They should talk to their legislators about, write to them in support of inclusive education. Be involved in the political process. That's what's happening right now. It's a number of people who've been complaining at school boards that have made these kinds of changes. People who have a different view about it should come out, and they should, I won't say duke it out because that might be literal on the part of some people, but they should argue about it and make their feelings known.
There are a few questions about the 1619 project, and yesterday's speaker, Elliot Cohen, was asked about that and spoke to what he believed are inaccuracies and referenced Gordon Wood's response and account. Can you speak to how we should look to the 1619 project as an understanding of history and to the debate that continues around this work?
Yeah, well, the 1619 project has two versions of it. There's the magazine version, and then there's the book version. And in the magazine version, they changed things that it said in the book version about I guess the thing that set Gordon off and others off was saying that the revolution was fought to protect slavery. And I think they may have changed it in the book to say one of the reasons that it was fought. But I think you should look at it as an attempt to make people understand the importance of the institution of slavery. 1619 is seen as an origin story for African Americans in North America. And one of the points I make in my book is that there were people of African descent in North America in the 1500s, but they were Spanish-speaking people. And because Spain didn't win the contest for North America, we fixate on 1619 in Great Britain, and that makes sense. That's an important date for people to remember. I don't think it's the origin of the United States, because there is no United States in 1619. Nobody knows what that is. But it's a way of explaining the centrality of slavery to the formation of North America. And so it should be looked at like that. I mean, it wasn't, people fixated just on that comment about the revolution at the beginning in the beginning essay. But there's more to the book. There's more to the progress, to the 1619 project than just that. So I think it's an important contribution to our understanding about slavery and the centrality of slavery in American life, and I think that's what the intent was. I understand.
There are a few questions that we're asking many of our speakers across the summer assembly season, and I wanted to ask, what is an issue or opinion on which you have personally evolved or changed your mind about recently?
Recently?
Doesn't need to be recently.
Oh, wow, that's a good one. Well, I would say in college, I was probably more, I don't know, I'll pick something else. No, I'll say it. In college, I was probably more what people would call pro-life than I am now. After being challenged by people and thinking about it, and I came to realize that for a number of people who fell into that camp, it was more about women, attitudes about women, than actually about life. And that was what changed my mind.
So if you were to write your book now after Juneteenth became a national holiday, what would you change?
The part where I say that there's no national, there's no recognition. Well, I would probably include in it the things that I hope that people do on Juneteenth about the celebration itself. It's a family holiday. It's a day for community, and what I would hope people would do is to have young people in their family take the oral histories of older members of their family. One of the things I say in the book is that my great-grandmother was alive until I was about 11, and I could just kick myself for not having listened to her about what it was like to live in Texas in the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, on a small farm in East Texas. And I know I could say it was bad. I know I could speak in generalities about it, but day-to-day things, what did you do? What was it like? How did you what were white people, the relations between whites and blacks on a daily basis like? How did that work itself out? And so I think that I would talk about that, how to celebrate the holiday, some ideas about doing it, because, we don't have anything so dramatic as slavery necessarily going on right now, but there's a pandemic. I mean, 100 years from now, we've gone through something that I don't think we really understand yet, have come to grips with yet over the past 3 years, with the whole world pretty much held hostage for a time by all of this. To have, stories about that, how individual people live. Now, of course, newspapers will do that as well, but to have it for your family, I think would be a good thing, as we may be facing the end of the American experiment in lots of ways. I mean, with the rise of authoritarianism, not just in the United States, but the attraction of that in other parts of the world. It would be interesting to have people talk about what that meant, how they're thinking about these things. Yeah, so that would be what I would write. I would probably, if still trying to get it under 30,000 words, I would talk a bit about that, about how to celebrate the holiday, and that would be one of my suggestions.
So our last question for this morning. These backlashes seem to come in cycles with progress. How do we overcome what can sometimes feel like enormous backlash in order to continue making progress?
Work harder. I mean, if you're making a change, there are people who don't want the change. I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise that there's going to be a backlash. They have values and feelings too. They're people. And they may have good reasons or think they have good reasons for the way they want to maintain a particular status quo. The only thing you could do is to just, as I said before, keep the faith and keep fighting, because good things don't happen without effort, very often, and that's what we have to keep doing.
Chautauqua, please join me in thanking Annette Gordon-Reed.
CHQ Assembly is made possible through the collaboration and innovation of Chautauqua Institution's full-time and part-time staff, seasonal staff, and many volunteers, as well as participants like you, whose engagement, gifts, and subscriptions sustain our mission.